call Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. I would like to just elaborate on some of Ron Mark's points in his tax bill. I actually think SOP. I actually think it's a good idea for a number of reasons, but let me explain those, but let me provide a very clear but to what he said. First and foremost, as he alluded to, I'm from Napier. There are two places in the last 100 years where people have died as a result of building collapse due to an earthquake. Christchurch and in 1931 in Napier. Napier was completely rebuilt from the ground up, and a number of these buildings have not been designated heritage buildings for a number of reasons, but they were built like the proverbial. They were built not to fall down if there was another earthquake. And so what we see in Napier is a whole lot of buildings that if there is a massive earthquake, their structural integrity might be compromised, but these buildings are not going to fall down. And there are a number of building owners there, and one in particular, he has a joke. He says, how do you make a small fortune out of renovating old buildings? You start with a big one, a big fortune. Because the cost of doing this, of getting it up to scratch, is immense. And we are very lucky in Napier that this one person in particular understands the heritage value and is a Napier man born and bred, because the problem we have got right across provincial New Zealand is that often the cost of getting these buildings up to standard is actually more than the buildings themselves are worth. And we've heard Wellington MPs speak and Christchurch MPs speak, but it is a different situation in provincial New Zealand, because in Christchurch and in Wellington, you can actually justify a cost of getting these buildings up to scratch because you know the yield you will get off these buildings is enough to cover the costs. In fact, we have the Minister of Heritage here, and Culture and Heritage, and I would actually love to have just a 5-minute call, Mr Finlayson, just to get your view on what should happen around heritage buildings that are maybe worth a couple of $100,000 but cost. Oh, it's never over for you. It's never over for you. In fact, you're on the ascendancy, I would suggest. But it is a major issue in provincial New Zealand, and the member for Wanganui knows exactly what I'm talking about, because there are examples of fantastic heritage in the main CBD. But the cost of getting those buildings up to compliance is such that I would bet a number of landlords are just not even going to go there. So there are two options. As Mr Mark suggested, they pull them down and they build something else. But what I suspect will happen in a lot of the smaller towns, and I was in Eltham recently, some beautiful buildings, and is they'll just walk away from them. They'll just say, it's not worth it to me, I'll walk away. So what we will end up with is actually these ghost towns, because the buildings themselves are just not worth the price of even demolishing them. So the council, at some point in time, will end up having to take responsibility. So Mr Mark's SOP brings up a very interesting point, and that is capitalisation versus expensing. But what I would really like to know before I certainly, as our revenue spokesperson, would make any comment on this, is what would be the fiscal cost of actually doing this? Because there would be a substantial cost. Let's understand what that cost is, and then once we do that, I think we can have a much more educated conversation around whether we want the IRD to take this further. If it's literally millions and millions of dollars, that's a different question opposed to if it's not so much. So let's see if we can get that quantified. And I would like to ask the Minister of Inland Revenue if in fact he would instruct the IRD to do some work around this, because I think it is very relevant and it is worth it. The second thing I would like to talk about is actually the ACT members, Mr Seymour's SOP. Now, the reason for this is because I actually think this is a good idea. We talk about managing risk, and we can always manage risk, we can mitigate risk, we can never eliminate risk. But in this bill, if we look at 133AC, we talk about the meaning of a priority building. And one of these, 1B, talks a building that is likely to be needed in an emergency for use in an emergency, as an emergency shelter or emergency centre. Now, Mr Chair, I would suggest that that includes churches, that includes sporting facilities like, for example, racing clubs, which are used rather infrequently. But I come back to the previous point, and I agree with Mr Seymour on this, that we are talking about buildings there that are infrequently used. The Hawke's Bay Racing Club might have, I don't know, 5 or 6 meetings a year, but it is certainly not used on a regular basis, and yet with this legislation as it stands, The cost of rehabilitating, I would suggest the Hawke's Bay, Mr Chair.
Stuart Nash.
Thank you. The Hawke's Bay Racing Club's club rooms would be prohibitive, as with a number of churches around the place. Now, so we're talking about high priority buildings under the definition of the Act because they could well be used by a shelter, but we're also talking about buildings that are very rarely, well not very rarely, aren't used that often. So we're not talking about office blocks or anything like this that are regularly tenanted. We are talking about buildings that have irregular use, but, and this is where the but is, but might be a little bit earthquake prone. So like Mr Twyford, I approach this with a very, very open mind. And in fact, being from provincial New Zealand and understanding the costs and the issues around this, I have a tendency to support it. And I was sort of hoping, and I know the Minister and the Chair is not the Minister responsible for this bill, but I was sort of hoping during the dinner adjournment that the officials had a bit of time, had an hour and a half to sort of consider some of the points that Mr Seymour brought up, and perhaps through the Minister and the Chair, even though as mentioned, I accept she's not the Minister in charge of this, could provide some answers to this, because I think there are many people right across provincial New Zealand, and I certainly know in my electorate, who are looking at this SOP saying this is pragmatic. And let me make it clear, we do not want people in buildings that are liable to collapse if a wolf blows on it. You know, there has to be an element of safety in this. But again, I come back to some of the buildings, and I know before the Christchurch earthquake that the University of Canterbury was doing a whole lot of work around the structural integrity of wooden buildings. And what they found is that wood, in fact, has massive structural integrity. I know in the Napier earthquake, a whole lot of chimneys fell down. The houses moved quite a lot, but they didn't fall down. But under this definition here, I don't see, you know, wooden buildings mentioned, and I suppose you can't. And I know that Mr Twyford brought up some very interesting questions about the logistics. How do we do this? I mean, I don't think that is a major issue to overcome, because what we are asking councils to do is take the bulk of responsibility for this. I think if we said to our local councils or the territorial authorities responsible for this, hey, this is just another part of the bill, it's another part of the legislation that you're in charge of policing or you have responsibility for, then they would take that on and they would develop a type of register or database or whatever was necessary to make sure that this part of the legislation was enacted. Now, that's all I'll say for now, but there are some very important questions that do need answering, because I think Mr Seymour has introduced a common sense SOP, but there are some questions. Thank you very much.
David Seymour, final call.